talking with some of you beforehand that I'm so excited about talking about two things at the same time that I really love and am passionate about. One much more than the other, God and the brain. I usually only get to talk about one or the other, right? I'm either teaching neuroscience and thinking primarily about the brain, or teaching in our small group or Sunday school talking about God. So I'm really excited to have the opportunity to talk about both tonight. And obviously I recognize that not all of you are or want to be neuroscientists here, so we're not going to go too deep into the neuroscience. But I still think it's a really intriguing topic, and I'm hoping that you'll find it valuable as we think about the connection between the mind and God. I'm going to be talking tonight about what's been referred to as the most complex organ or the most complex system in the known universe. And that might sound like a surprising thing to say that our brain is the most complex structure in the universe, but I'm hoping that maybe by the end of the talk tonight that I might convince you of why many scientists agree that that's the case. The incredible degree of complexity of the brain is simply staggering. And so there's a great story of one of my colleagues in the field from Stanford. He tells the story of one of the freshman courses for undergraduate, an introduction to neuroscience. And the way he starts out the course is he says, imagine everything that we were to know about the brain would be a mile. So say if we were to know everything there possibly is to know about the brain, that would be a mile. How far do you think we've traveled down that road? And so he had the students kind of raise their hands and give suggestions, and he heard things like, maybe 3/4 of a mile, or a half a mile, or a quarter of the mile down the road. And he said, how about 3 inches? And I think that that's probably one of the most accurate representations of how little we actually know about the brain. And I'm hoping to maybe highlight that at a very high level today. It's incredibly complex. And so that's kind of my goal by the end of tonight. And then also, obviously, to relate that to thinking about the potential for a creator, God. So I'll go ahead, and I do want to at least introduce the nervous system briefly. We can already begin to see at the beginning, just thinking about the complexity of the brain, just in terms of the numbers of cells. Okay, you guys know that a cell is an individual unit. Your body is made up of trillions of cells, and your brain is no different. The neurons, so neurons are the cells in your brain. They're specialized cells. And you have approximately 100 billion neurons in the brain and about 13.5 million neurons in the spinal cord. All right. Now, these aren't even all the cells in your brain. These are just the neurons. In fact, the other cells that are in your brain, called glial cells, there are millions of those as well, but we don't know almost anything about what they do, other than we know that they're important for controlling the environment of the brain, the ionic environment, clearing debris and various things as support structure cells. So this isn't even the full picture. Now, remember, these neurons do not exist in isolation. They connect to each other. And so they form connections in order to be able to signal to other neurons in the brain. And it's estimated, again, these are difficult things to actually calculate, but it's the most accepted estimate is around 100 trillion synapses in your brain. Now, these numbers become almost astronomical. It's almost impossible for us to understand what does that even mean, 100 trillion. And so one of the best ways that I can think of, and even this is really inadequate, is to think about the number of stars in the Milky Way galaxy. You actually have more neurons in your brain than you have stars in the entire Milky Way galaxy, and you have more connections in your brain, 500 times more connections in your brain than there are stars in the Milky Way galaxy. And this is just in your head. Okay, so just think about the complexity of trying to understand something that has that many moving parts, that many connections, that many signals going back and forth, and trying to understand how that's processing on a moment-to-moment basis. It's incredibly complex. Now, I want to kind of zoom in a little bit and think about the neurons themselves, because I think sometimes this is helpful. And this is an individual neuron, so kind of what we've been talking about here. If we were to zoom in on just one of those neurons, it would look like this. This is just a cartoon, okay? This is not how the neurons actually look. They're not like blue and things like that, okay? But it's just a cartoon. And my laser pointer, unfortunately, doesn't work, but you guys can see it has a cell, just like other cells. It has a nucleus, and it has these specialized processes. And these neurons are specialized for sending signals. And what's amazing about the cells in your brain is that they're able to turn themselves into one of these. Okay, this is a battery. Now, we won't go into the details of this because, again, I know that you guys aren't interested in the neurobiology here, but these neurons are able to regulate ions that go in and out of the cell, and by carefully controlling what charged ions go in and out of the cell, they're able to set themselves up and create within and among themselves a battery. So if we were to take and measure the voltage difference between the negative end of a battery and the positive end of this battery, how much do you think it would be? If you're going to measure the voltage difference between these two ends, assuming it was a fresh battery. 1.5 volts, hopefully, because that's what it says on the side of it, right? There should be a voltage difference. That's how we use that to run things, right? That's why we use batteries. Well, if you were to measure the inside of a cell relative to the outside of a neuron, there's a difference, a voltage difference, of about 0.07 volts, okay, about 70 millivolts. So obviously that's much smaller than a battery, but remember you have billions of these, billions of tiny little batteries that are able to use that potential energy that's stored in them to create electrical signals. And those signals can then be sent to all over your body. That's how you're able to perceive me, to be able to hear the words coming out of my mouth, or able to move your muscles, is because all those signals are coming into your brain and being processed by signals being sent by these neurons. And so these cells then receive signals. You can see the arrow there on what are called dendrites. And they send information out. Okay, so send information to the next cell using this long process that you can see highlighted here called the axon. And these are literally a process of the cell that can be incredibly long. So for a typical adult male, you can have axons. Typically, you have axons that are 1 meter long. That is, you have a cell that extends a whole meter in your body from your thalamus in your brain all the way down your spinal cord. And so it's incredible that they're able to extend these long processes and send signals at incredible speeds, transmitting signals up to about 100 meters per second. It has to be this fast, right? I mean, say you're at a baseball game and you have your head down, you hear a crack of the bat, and you look up and there's a line drive coming at you, okay? Now, how much time do you have to be able to detect those photons of light that are coming from that baseball, determine its speed, send those signals to the visual cortex, process that information in the rest of the brain, then send that to the motor cortex to send signals down to your muscle, to contract your muscle, to be able to raise your hand and catch the ball before it smacks you in the face. All that has to be done in a fraction of a second, right? And so the brain is incredible at being able to do that by sending these incredibly fast signals. And the primary way it does this is through insulation. I don't know if you guys can see the little myelin sheaths, little fat capsules that help to cover the axon and increase the speed at which signals can go down the length of it. Now, I mentioned the connections between neurons, and again, we're almost done with the biology. So if you guys are, are starting to feel like, oh my goodness, are we going to be tested on this, or what's going on? Okay, this is just to give you a bit of an introduction of the complexity here. These synapses are connections between neurons, and they are so important for the brain to be able to connect and send these signals that can be carried both from your body, that sends signals to your brain about what your body's doing and where you are in space, and then from your brain to your body to help control your body. And so if you can see this video, okay, what this is a video of neurons actually firing action potentials, making those signals, turning themselves from a little battery into a signal. Can you guys see the little flashes of light there? And so if you were to see your brain, if we were able to look at your brain under a microscope right now, we'd see literally billions of these neurons firing. If you look closely, you might even be able to see some processes light up every once in a while. And of course, your brain doesn't glow green. Okay, it doesn't actually look like this. So we have to come up with tools to visualize this. And this has really been in the last decade, probably one of the most exciting times in neuroscience, because with the development of microscopes and dyes like this, to be able to visualize what's actually in your brain using fluorescent dyes, we are able to see and understand the brain in ways that we never have before. So I want to show you a quick video by one of my colleagues at Stanford, Carl Disseroth, that I think will show you just the beauty and the complexity of the brain.
We're heading into the center of a mouse's brain, into the hippocampus, where memories are formed. Looking up, you can see neurons projecting to the surface of the brain. This is the work of Carl Disseroth and his team at Stanford University. By making the entire brain transparent, they were able to image it using a light microscope. They call the new technique clarity. Existing techniques for studying the brain's wiring are often limited to looking at very small volumes of brain, or they don't allow you to label genes or chemicals of interest. The advantage of clarity is that you can label lots of molecules in whole brains. So how do you make a brain transparent? The thing that obscures the view is fat. Lipid layers surround each cell. To remove them without disrupting the cell structure, the team used a hydrogel to create a mesh to hold the rest of the components in place. Then they could clear away the fat. This is a mouse brain before and after. The brain is now transparent to light, but it's also permeable to molecules, which means scientists can add molecular markers to highlight specific features. In this 1 millimeter block of hippocampus, excitatory neurons are green, inhibitory neurons are red, and cells called astrocytes are blue. The technique works in human brains too. This is a chunk of the frontal lobe of a 7-year-old boy who had autism. It's possible to trace the path of a single nerve projection through a forest of other cells. When the team looked closely in one layer of the cortex, they noticed ladder-like patterns where neurons had connected back to themselves and to other neurons. Similar abnormal structures have been seen in animals with autism-like behaviours. Being able to analyse brain structures like this and match them up with molecular information could help neuroscientists uncover how changes to the brain underlie disease. And it's not just the brain. The researchers say the technique could be applied to any organ.
Okay. So, it's a beautifully complex organ, and I hope that you can see some of the beauty in it. I love watching those videos, especially the ones where you have multiple colors of all the neurons. And as I said, that's only just a fraction. If we were to label every neuron in the brain, there'd be so much label you wouldn't even be able to see individual things. So they only label a subset of the neurons. So you're only seeing a fraction of what is in the brain in each given time. I was actually at the conference when Carl, who did this research, presented this for the very first time. And it was the first time I've ever been at a talk in a conference where after he presented, and they hadn't made this video yet for Nature, so he had just presented some of the videos the fly-throughs and the zoom-ins of the brain that they showed in that video. And after the talk, nobody even said anything. It was just quiet. Nobody even clapped. They were just so amazed at the videos that they had just seen and how incredible it was to be able to see the brain for the first time in that way. It was a really neat experience, and it really blew the scientific community away with what he was able to do. Now, as I mentioned, the last thing I'll say about the brain is just thinking about the storage capacity when you're able to combine so many neurons, not only just the number of neurons, but the fact that each neuron in your brain can be involved in the storage or retrieval of many memories. Okay? So what that means is that it's not just like one memory, one neuron. Each neuron can be involved in the storage of many memories, and so as a result, you exponentially increase the storage capacity of the brain. And in fact, Paul Reber at Northwestern University recently published a paper in which he calculated that the storage capacity of the brain is 2.5 petabytes. Okay, 2.5 petabytes. And this has been, at least at this point, generally accepted by the scientific community. Now, again, what does that even mean? Right? What's 2.5 petabytes? I didn't even know what that was. And so I had to actually look up how many bytes that was. So that's a lot of bytes, okay? Well, what does that even mean? How can we put that into terms that we might understand? So if we could just imagine that our brain was a digital recorder, and say we wanted to record TV, okay? You, in order to store that much data, would have to store 3 million hours of television in order to be able to store that much data in your brain. Okay? So that's about 300 years worth of Netflix reruns. So that's a lot, it's a lot of time of just continuously recording. So again, just thinking about the complexity of the brain and what it's able to store is really amazing. Now, some of you may be thinking, okay, well, are human brains really even that unique, though? Yes, that's amazing and that's incredible, but animal brains are pretty amazing as well, right? We did a fly-through in that mouse brain, and that looked pretty complex. So are human brains really even that unique compared to the rest of the animal kingdom? So for example, you might have someone that says, well, yes, humans' brains are unique. They allow us to the ability to use tools. And so someone might challenge that and say, well, gorillas have been seen to use a stick and as a tool to be able to force out ants and have a good snack. All right, so that doesn't separate us. Well, someone might say, well, humans are unique in their ability to have empathy towards other animals. And you say, well, elephants mourn actually after the death of another elephant. All right, isn't that empathy? And then someone might say, okay, well, it's communication. The human brain allows us to communicate in ways that other animals aren't. And so someone might say, well, a chimpanzee can learn sign language and be able to communicate via sign language. In fact, there have been a number of studies that have looked to see, is there even anything unique about the human brain at all? In fact, they would argue, well, based on mass, for example, one measurement, just the mass of the brain, our brains are actually fairly small compared to some other brains. For example, elephants have 4 times as heavy a brain as we do. Okay? Or, for example, what about the number of neurons? We just think about the total number of neurons. Well, humans don't have the most of those either. Again, thinking about other animals, especially elephants, they have 3 times as many neurons. In fact, some of you may have seen this picture of this elephant which appears to be painting a picture of itself. Has anybody ever seen a video or this picture in the past? Okay, a few of you have, I see. This is very interesting. It appears, at least from this picture, that this elephant is engaging in a portrait of itself, a freehand portrait, or maybe I should say a free trunk portrait of itself. Okay, so are human brains really that unique? Well, there's a couple things we have to be careful of here. First of all, if we just think about this picture, this is a little misleading. This is this elephant, Suda, from Thailand. They actually found out that in order for this elephant to be able to create this self-portrait, it really isn't a self-portrait at all. They spent actually years training the elephant to just make stereotypical brush strokes, right? That if did in a certain combination would eventually create an elephant next to flowers, okay? And so and in fact, even just teaching an elephant to use a brush with putting paint on it for them they can make something. This is more what they look like, okay, which is still, I think, interesting, and maybe some abstract art. But it's very different than a self-portrait that a human might be able to make. The other thing we have to be careful of is measuring things simply on mass or the number of neurons. We have to think about how the brain is structured. So, for example, one of the things that we've learned as we've studied the brain is that certain parts of the brain are much more involved in high-order processing. Things like consciousness and emotion and personality and behavior and all these things that we think of when we think of what it means to be human. And the cerebral cortex, particularly the frontal lobe, so this part right behind the front of my skull is called the frontal lobe. And again, my laser pointer won't work on the TV, but these structures that are right here are actually olfactory bulbs. So these aren't the frontal lobe. This is actually the sense of smell. This is a mouse. This is the frontal lobe, which is right here in the front. And you can see that it's much larger, and if we think about the number of neurons in even just the cerebral cortex, humans have almost 3 times as many even as elephants, and even more than other primates. Again, in the areas of the brain that are involved in higher order functioning. And so when we think about this question, we have to think a little bit more broadly. Are humans unique? And if so, what makes them unique? And so I think it's important for us to ask a few questions as we're thinking about this, because I think this relates to my talk. For example, if we think about self-consciousness, are animals able to see their place in the world, in the bigger picture of the world, and where they fit in, and even do things in order to affect their role in that world? If we think about beauty, are animals able to appreciate beauty? And by beauty, I mean all kinds of beauty, whether that's a symphony or a sunset or a set of flowers. Are animals aware of their own future death? Are animals able to consider that one day they will die? Do animals have a sense of morality, a conscious sense of what's right and what's wrong? Do animals have an understanding or contemplate the reason for their existence, right? Why are we here? What's the purpose and the meaning of life? And finally, do animals, like every culture of humans in the world, have a desire to seek, follow, and worship some higher power? Now, we have to say this with a caveat. Obviously, these are very difficult things to measure, right? How do you measure whether or not an animal is thinking about its own death? Okay, that's a very difficult thing to measure. So we have to be careful here. But at least at this point, there's no scientific evidence to suggest that animals are able to have these functions. These are uniquely human. And so when we think about the brain and we think about these things that the brain is able to do and part of who we are, we have to think about why. A number of years ago, I was taking a med school course here at Pitt, and it was a neuroanatomy course, and we were working with cadavers, and we were, obviously memorizing. There was a lot of memorization in that course, and we were memorizing various nerves of the brain, and they put a human brain in my hand. And the first thing that you notice, it's one of those things that's almost deceiving. It's much heavier than it looks. When they put it in your hands kind of, you don't expect it to be so dense and so heavy. And as I was holding it, it was the first time I'd ever held a brain in my hands. I remember just this sense of awe came over me, and I thought, this person's entire world, all of their hopes, their fears, their dreams, their knowledge, their love towards others, all of those things are wrapped up in my hands. It was a really incredible feeling for the first time to be able to do that and to feel that. And so when we think about the brain, we have to ask ourselves the question, why? Why does our brain give us the ability to do these things? What advantage do we have of being able to be self-conscious and think about our own death and what's right and wrong and where we're going to go after we die? All those types of things that are uniquely human. Why? And so I want to go ahead and give you my hypothesis up front. Okay, most people don't do that, but I'm going to go ahead and give you my hypothesis now, and then I'm going to spend a little bit of time, the rest of our time, kind of explaining that. And I want to answer the question, why did God create us with such a complex and amazing structure to think with? Now, already right off the bat, there's an assumption here. Right? What's the assumption? The assumption is that we were created, that this is not an accident, that the complexity of the brain was built by a designer. Now, again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that. Dr. Weber and Dr. Snoke did a much better job than I ever could have, and hopefully I know some of you maybe went to his talk and talked about just the complexity of our bodies, all the way from the molecular motors that are running in our cells that allow us to make energy, these little molecular machines, all the way up to our eye that's more smooth than any surface we find in nature because of the drops, the liquid that's on it, and if it was dried out, we wouldn't even be able to see, all the complexity. And you have to ask yourself at some point, could that have what's the probability that arose from nothing? What's the probability of it, mathematically? If I brought one of my textbooks here, and just imagine that I were to give you this textbook and I were to put it on your lap and just kind of have you leaf through it, and you would see different pictures and diagrams, chapters of information, legends underneath pictures, and organization of information. And I were to give this to you and say, okay, what's the probability that this came from nothing versus the probability that it was designed? And of course, all this would point, well, there's fingerprints all over this of a designer, right? I mean, probably multiple designers that had to think through, okay, how is this information going to be organized, and where are we going to put the pictures, and how is that picture going to relate to this information and the figure that we put under it, and all these details, right? And you might be saying, well, Dr. Hovis, that's very different than our own bodies, right? That evolved. But I would say, yeah, that's absolutely true. We're infinitely more complex than this book, right? What's the probability that came from nothing? Thinking about the complexity that we see in our bodies and in our brains, mathematically, at least you have to come to some realization with me that there's at least some probability that this isn't an accident, that there's some design that went into this incredible complexity that we see at every level of our body. And so with that being said, if it is true, if there really is a creator God that made us, why? Why would he give us a brain in the way that he did, with all these abilities that we just talked about? And so my hypothesis this morning, or this evening I should say, is that God created us. There's a creator that created us with such a complex organ for the very purpose of using it as a means of knowing him and worshiping him. Okay? So that's my hypothesis. And so now what I want to do is I want to unpack that a little bit with just a couple of short questions that I'm going to go through. Okay, a couple of objections that someone might raise to these things, and then try and think through this. So the first question that I want to think about is say, okay, Dr. Hovis, let's just assume that there might be a creator. Let's just assume that's a possibility. If God really does exist, if there really is a creator, then why doesn't he just show himself to me? Have you ever had, maybe you've thought these thoughts yourself, or you've had someone else that have thought this, right? I've said to you, if God would just show me right here and right now that he's real, then I would believe. If I could just have irrefutable evidence, if he was just to appear right now so that we could all see him by speaking to us or giving us some vision, why can't he just do that, right? And so I want to think about that and think about what might be the possible answer to that. Of course, we do see in the scriptures of the Bible that God did reveal himself in that way at times, in dreams and in visions, and actually speaking to individuals. But here's the point of what I want to argue tonight. I think the answer to this, if I can get this to go to the next one, is that God has already spoken to us. And in fact, in a far greater way, I would argue, than simply him appearing to us before our eyes and just simply speaking a word or giving us a vision right here. He has revealed himself to us, and God has willed that the clearest and most authoritative example or reference of him in the world, this side of heaven, is the Bible itself. That's been kept down miraculously through the ages. Now, I want to think about this for a little bit. In 1948, near the Dead Sea in Jordan, there was discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, a number of scrolls that had not only ancient writings of the Scriptures, but also other historical documents. And what was incredible is for the first time, we were able to get a glimpse of a version of Scripture that was at least 1,000 years before the earliest version that any of us had ever seen before. And so it was a great opportunity for scientists the world over to be able to examine these and compare the version that came from around, it's thought to be these Dead Sea Scrolls were around 250 BC, so only removed from when the originals were thought to be written, maybe a couple hundred years, and compare that to the version that we have today. And for example, the book of Isaiah, when they compared, they actually had basically a full copy of Isaiah from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and 1,000 years later, and even longer than that, the version that we have now, they compared those two. And do you know how many differences they found between those two versions of the Scripture, of Isaiah? A long book, by the way. 3 words. And those 3 words were only different in the spelling of those 3 words. Okay. Didn't change the meaning in any way. Now, think about that. Think about how incredible and miraculous that is to have that kind of continuity between 2 books that were written at least 1,000 years apart from each other, and even longer in some cases. Now think about if God just had revealed himself orally. Have you guys ever played that game Telephone? Right? You guys know what you do in Telephone? Maybe not everybody knows that game. It's a game where you kind of get in a circle and you have a story that you tell and you whisper it to the person beside you, and then that person whispers it and it kind of goes around the circle, and then at the end the last person says the story and you see how different the original story is from what is at the end. Okay, has anybody ever played that game? Let me see a show of hands. Okay, so what have you guys found from playing that game? How similar are those stories by the end? Yeah, in fact, that's the whole point of the game. It's kind of fun to see how different the stories are, even when you're just going around 5 different people. Now, can you imagine if that was how God had communicated to us over the ages through oral communications, only passed down orally from generation to generation and not written? It's incredible to think of that what we have. Why is this so important? Well, I think because what we have is a complete revelation of God himself. Everything that he wants us to know, that he's revealed to people and individuals over hundreds of years, we now have on our smartphones and can access at any time. Preserved miraculously from generation to generation, that has everything that we could need to know about who he is and who we are and how we might become in relationship with him. Isn't that far greater than just simply hearing some story or hearing? We have everything that we need. And so I think the answer to this question is that God has spoken. He's spoken to us through his word. Now, this brings us to the second question, which is, okay, well, let's even assume that maybe that is the case. Maybe God does exist and maybe he did reveal himself in the Bible. But isn't it true that we kind of have to suspend our reason in order to believe in that? I was driving to work this morning and I was behind a car, and on the car there was a bumper sticker. And it says, "The less you know, the more you believe." Has anybody ever heard that bumper sticker or seen it? The less you know, the more you believe. Now think about the idea behind that, right? The idea behind that is, look, religion, understanding, believing in a creator, that's really for individuals who can't really explain, don't know enough to be able to explain what they see around them. And so they create something in order to help make themselves feel better. Right? Help to explain the things that they can't understand or explain themselves. Okay. And so you may have heard individuals that felt that they needed to suspend their reason or their process of thinking in order to believe in God or the Bible. I hope that you get from these talks, the series from Dr. Weber and Dr. Snook and myself, that we actually believe it's the opposite. Right? The more that I know, the more I'm compelled to believe. The more I dig into the mysteries of the brain or the mysteries of the body, the more it's undeniable. I cannot help but believe that there's some creator there. It's actually the opposite for me. And so is it possible that it could be actually the opposite? That God designed us, the Creator designed us for the very purpose of having such a complex organ in order to be able to read and think hard as a means of knowing Him. That He revealed Himself through this incredible thing called the Bible, through this written word, that then we can use our brains to read and to study and to understand as a means of knowing Him. That it's actually the opposite. You're not supposed to check your brain at the door, but you're supposed to check in at the door, right? You're supposed to read and think hard about what is revealed in the Scriptures. In fact, I would argue that this is actually what the Bible teaches. Take a look with me at a couple of these verses. In Ephesians 3, for example, it says, Paul is saying to his hearers and his readers, he says, when you read this, that is, when you read what I'm writing to you, you can perceive my insight into the mystery of Christ. Right? There's thinking involved here. You're reading, and as you're reading, you're getting insight, perceiving something that's difficult to understand, namely this mystery of who Jesus is. Okay? Or, for example, 2 Timothy. 2 Timothy 2. Again, Paul is talking here, and he says, think over what I say, for the Lord will give you understanding in everything. Okay? Think over what I say. Now, I want us to think for just a moment about this and think about what it means to actually read. Okay? I mean, have you ever actually thought about how incredibly amazing it is, the act of reading a written text? So, when you're growing up, you learn that these little symbols that are on the page here have sounds, right? And that you learn over time through these associations that you can group different letters together. Okay, these little symbols are called letters, and then if you group them together, and by the way, they can be grouped together thousands of different ways, but if you group them together in particular arrangements, that they make words. And that these words are not just some abstract thing, but they refer to reality, right? A chair, or a grandmother, or the sunset. So that as we're reading those things, seeing those symbols, we're thinking about reality, things that are around us. And that if that wasn't enough, that we're able to take the idea, the patterns of activity in one person's brain, and to be able to communicate that, put it onto paper or some form of written form, and then transmit that idea to another human being. I mean, that's really what you're doing when you're reading the Bible. You're taking an idea that some author had thousands of years ago through the patterns of activity of their own brain, and you're transferring that same idea to your own brain through the written word. That's incredible. It's incredible to think about. And I believe that God designed that for this very purpose, right? That He designed us with a brain to be able to do that as a means of knowing who He is as He revealed Himself through the Word. Now, this brings us to our final question that you may be asking. Okay, all right, say we accept all of this, then why doesn't everybody who reads the Bible automatically become a Christian? Dr. Hovis, you just told me that we need to think hard. If we think hard and read the text, God has revealed Himself to us in that, and so why doesn't everybody who read the Bible become a Christian? So I think in order to answer that question, again, we have to look at, well, what does the Bible teach about coming to faith, coming to know who God is? And the answer is that God uses both our brain and the work of Himself in order to bring people to know who He truly is, to faith in Jesus Christ. And you might be saying, well, but you just got done telling me that we need to think. So is it us thinking that does it, or is it God revealing himself that does it. Which one is it? It can't be both. Well, in fact, it can be both. And in fact, the Bible actually teaches that it is both. We can't so easily separate these two and try to categorize them. In fact, if we just go back to the verse we were just thinking of, we just read, where Paul says, think over what I say. So here's this act of thinking, right, using our brain. And then he uses this connector word, for the Lord will give you understanding in everything. And so you have to say, well, Paul, which is it? Is it God who gives the understanding, or is it me thinking? Well, it's both. The writer doesn't say, well, think hard, because it's all up to you. Or he doesn't say, well, don't worry about thinking. You don't have to worry about that. God's going to take care of that. You just sit there. Okay? No. It's both of these things simultaneously in this incredible combination of our brain and the work of the Holy Spirit that's allowing us to know and to understand him. So I want us to contemplate this as we bring this to a close, especially for those of you in this room who are students. Right? Don't check your brain at the door. Right? Use it. God gave it to you for the very purpose of knowing him. But that is not enough. Thinking hard and reading hard the text is not enough. Right? We need to come to the text crying out to God, Lord, if you really do exist, if there really is a creator and you have revealed yourself in this word, then reveal yourself to me. What's amazing about this sentence is that the ground for why we should think hard is because the Lord will give us understanding. Do you see that connection here, that word for? Right? Think hard. Why? Because God desires to give you understanding. He desires to reveal himself to you. So God working in our lives is the ground or the purpose or the motivation for us to think hard with our brains. And so I want to encourage you to do both of those things. Cry out to God and go to the text and think hard about what it says and decide for yourself. The last thing that I want to mention, and this is the last slide, I want to reiterate my hypothesis that I believe God created us, that we were formed by a creator with a complex and incredible brain for the very purpose of being able to use it as a means to know and worship him. But here's the key. The end is not the thinking. The end is not even the knowledge that comes from the thinking and the reading. The end, the goal, why did God create us? Why did God reveal himself to us in the Bible? Why did he give us such a complex brain to be able to read and understand him? The goal of all that wasn't just so that we could store up a bunch of facts about who this creator is. The goal is because he's worthy of being worshiped. He's the greatest thing in all of creation. And so my hope is that as you go to the scriptures and you read verses like Psalm 99 where it says that the Lord is great and he's exalted over all the people, and then it speaks about him revealing himself. He says, in a pillar of the cloud, he, that is God, spoke to them, and they kept his testimonies and his statutes. So here's God revealing himself to mankind, and what was mankind's response? Right? Let them praise your great and awesome name. Holy is he. Exalt the Lord and worship at his footstool. My desire is that as you come to the Bible and as you come and think hard and pray hard as you read it, that you'll see something in there, some creator that's so irresistible that it's not just enough for you to know facts about him, but that your desire would be to worship him, to love him, to know him. Right? That's the creator that I believe the Bible reveals. And that's the end of all of our thinking hard, is to know him and worship him.